just give me another minute so we project the cover of the book we'll be talking about. But before we get to the book, maybe I should say a few words of introduction to our main speaker today, Professor Ayşe Zarakol, Cambridge University. For those of you who study international relations, she probably doesn't need any introduction. Very eminent scholar of international politics. I must also add that her approach to the global affairs is very close to my heart, very much grounded in history, relative study of various empires, not just the Ottoman Empire, from which we both sort of derived from Ayşe, but also Greater Eurasia. It's a good opportunity to advertise, as if it's advertised, of her book, Before the West Explodes Imperial Legacy in Eurasia, including China, the various permutations of what she called the Genghis order, Timurid, and the three Islamic empires, the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mongols, and how this impacts on international politics of today. It's a great piece of scholarship that I think many people will benefit from. The reason we are all gathered here is to talk about another book project where Ayşe contributed a chapter. The book by John Nickenbury, who is the editor, looks at the origins of what we call today liberal international order. And it's a contested term. Many people use the classical quip that it was never liberal and never order, because the hegemon had an exception, and was it truly international? But that's another method now that we are doing a post-mortem of the liberal international order. There's some good work there. And Ayşe contributed a chapter looking at the cases of Turkey and Russia as semi-outsiders that were invested into the earlier permutation, but eventually became disillusioned looking at the dynamics of the cases. Again, this is a very pertinent topic given the disintegration of order. We also have Roy Allison here, the professor of Russian and Eurasian studies at St. Antony's College, who has contributed extensively on the study of Russian international affairs, being on a Russian view of order, but also international law and norms as a commentator. And last but not least, before I pass to Ayşe, I couldn't but not have a chuckle when we decided on the date. 3rd of March, for those of you who are not in the know, is the date when the Russian Empire and the Ottomans concluded the Treaty of San Stefano in 1878. Is
that why you asked me?
I think that was Timothy Galthaness's choice to go for the 3rd, and but it's also the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But yes. That's a different story, as they say. Maybe I should shut up at this point. Again, look at the book, but over to you, Ayşe, to give us your main points. This is supposed to be as interactive as possible, so there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to react and ask questions.
Thank you, Dimitar, for the invitation, and also the European Studies Center, and thank you for coming. I mean, my talk is based on this chapter that I wrote for this book. It was I think, came out of a workshop right at the end of COVID period. So some years ago, and then I wrote the chapter. I was asked, this is not where my research is centered. I mean, these days I'm writing either about like distant past or kind of the future. But as part of this workshop, John and Peter asked me to kind of revisit my earlier work, which had focused a little bit more on this period, and also about like social hierarchies and the international order and so on, and provide an assessment from my own perspective. What, if anything, went wrong in the 1990s? That was the kind of the theme of the workshop. So then I wrote it, and then it became this book, which is now out. So I don't think it's appropriate for me to do a full-on presentation on something that's already published. But what I'm hoping is we can use some of the arguments I make in the chapter, Roy's responses to them, as kind of a springboard for a general conversation. Tim and I were at a symposium last week in Germany, where there was actually a very lively exchange between Tim and Yuri Sletskin, who's a historian of Russia, where the whole question was about actually 1990s, right? And this idea of, like, especially specifically in regards to Russia. And Yuri was saying Russia could never have been included in the liberal international order. I think you were saying that it could have been, right? I mean, I don't want to mischaracterize that there were some opportunities that were missed. So I'm going to kind of, I suppose, fall somewhere in between. I fall somewhere in between in this debate. And of course, I'm coming at it particularly from perspective of Turkey. I mean, I know more about the Turkish case, but I think there are similarities, and I wanted to write the chapter in a way, in a more general, I think there are similarities between how Russia and Turkey were treated in the 1990s, but maybe as a Russia expert, Roy disagrees. So, I mean, there are two overarching arguments in the chapter. One is that the grievances or the issues that both Russia and Turkey have with the West long predate, the liberal international order, decisions that were made in the 1990s. They have long histories going back at least to 19th century. And they were both kind of reading, both countries, I think, were reading the interactions through that lens. It's not that 1990s are, whatever mistakes were made in the 1990s, they're certainly not the beginning of the story. And I don't mean to say that it's all mistakes. But in the 1990s, I think there were a series of 1990s and maybe the 2000s, early 2000s, there were a series of bad decisions. And that ended up creating, I think, something like a halfway house, where both Turkey and Russia were neither in, but not fully out. And it was kind of the worst of both worlds. What I'm implying in the chapter is it would have been better, maybe include, but I think maybe they couldn't be included. I see the argument for that. But if they weren't going to be included, maybe to be fully excluded. And I think it's that, in-between situation that's kind of recycled and, the earlier grievances. So the way they kind of end up with a similar story in the 1990s, they start from different points. Obviously, Russia at the end of the Cold War, whereas Turkey was part of the Western Alliance. So the story that I'm telling in the chapter is Russia was allowed a little bit in the 1990s, even while it was undeserving, and Turkey was pushed back of the line, even when it was deserving. So as a result, they both kind of ended up in the same halfway house place. So that's the parallel story that I'm telling. So the old grievance is, as I said, goes back at least to the 19th century. It's this idea that there's like an inner kind of status quo to this international order. I mean, I've written about this extensively in my first book, and it's kind of a club that keeps treating, at least from the 19th century onwards, both Turkey and Russia, like previous incarnations, as like learner, not fully there, giving sometimes recognition, not recognition. A lot of subsequent foreign policies and domestic policies are like responses to this, like this desire for recognition, never getting it, or equal treatment. I can get more into that, but that's not the subject of the chapter. That's kind of in the background. In the 20th century, Turkey and Russia had different ways of dealing with this. What I call the stigmatization problem. But then again, in the 1990s, as I say, the fates converge. So, as I said, Russia gets a little bit of access, Council of Europe, G7, G8. After moments of crisis, there's this idea we're going to prop up Yeltsin, and so it gets. And whereas Turkey is downgraded, so while it was an associate member of the European Economic Community since 1964. And had started formal application process in '87. After Luxembourg summit, all these Central European, Eastern European countries like leapfrog in front of Turkey, and Turkey doesn't get candidate status, doesn't start until '99, doesn't start accession negotiations until 2005, and by that point, all these other countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechia, Slovenia, Latvia, all the Baltics, Malta, everybody is in. So that I think kind of created this idea that this is again kind of like Charlie Brown, Lucy and the Ball, kind of feeling, and that's not specific to particular leaders. Sorry. And it's a period. I mean, I guess the particular period is like 1990s. Both Russia and Turkey are quite in trouble, like economically, politically. So they're quite eagerly making concessions. There are blocs making the argument for inclusion in the West. So despite what Yuri said last week, I think there was a big bloc in Russia that thought Russia should be part of the West. But they were kept at kind of arm's length, and then so as these countries were reaching, they were kept at arm's length. Then in the 2000s, we kind of see the reversal of this. They're given almost too much credit. Erdogan and Putin. There's a similar story of there being, almost treated too credulous, welcomed, and democratization, westernization. So that's like arm's length policy changes exactly at the wrong time. And I think, one of the arguments that I make in the chapter is that, it's interesting, also reading the chapter from the vantage point of now, where mistakes are being made, but not out of goodwill. I think some of these mistakes were the naivete maybe of the period of this idea that democracy was eventually going to reach anywhere. So there was time to wait, or we could do cycles of inclusion. Eventually everybody's going to get in kind of stuff. So I don't know that this was malicious mistakes or mistake coming out of complete self-interest. Yeah, there was some of that. There is a degree of, again, this hierarchical thinking. There is certainly, even to this day, I think there is a degree of condescension that's involved. We certainly saw some evidence of that last week as well on part of the Germans. Some Germans were claiming that they taught Russians how to use computers and so on. So there's a bit of that. But at the same time, in terms of the decision maker level, I'm not convinced that it was just out of. I think it's this idea of the end of history, and it goes in cycles. So there's this relatively naive treatment of Putin and Erdogan in their early years. So all of this combining, and I don't want to take too much time here, because I'm hoping we can bring the discussion to maybe to the present day together as a group. So expectations were raised, and then they were not met, or they were met exactly at the wrong time. There was a timing issue, and that created this situation, as I said, this halfway situation where Russia and Turkey were both in enough to do damage, but not in enough to feel accepted or recognized, or and so on. And in with the wrong kind of people in charge, and that has allowed, I think, both countries at different degrees to undermine institutions from within to some extent, while at the same time, like, these particular leaders activating domestic audiences by saying, we're being treated hypocritically and we're not getting, enough recognition. Then I have a whole discussion at the end about what would have happened if they were included. So they probably couldn't be fully included for reasons we can discuss. But one of the conclusions I have is if they had been included, that might have come at the expense of Eastern European and Central European countries that were included, because their integration is not perfect either. If you look at the example of Hungary and so on, it probably would have been even less smooth had there not been these external, particularly Russia, threat. So it was probably a choice of one or the other, and I think we sometimes maybe overlook that when we talk about not including countries. And then I suppose that leads me to this very perverse conclusion that from the perspective of the EU or the liberal international order, maybe it would have been better, like some kind of transparency or like some kind of you're not going to get in. Maybe would have been better. I think it's as I say, like this raising expectations, like this opening of this charge of hypocrisy, combined with like this very long history of condescension. I think that just created like the perfect formula for the undermining of the liberal international, like this, as far as these countries are concerned. And finally, as how I have a short discussion of what that might tell us about Ukraine. Although it's not exactly the same, because Ukraine now is defining itself in opposition to Russia. So whatever happens probably will, its identity has evolved in a way that it will stick with the side of the West or liberal international or whatever we call it, the current situation. But still, there is to be a lesson. Like if you keep promising stuff and then you don't deliver, that's kind of a recipe for long-term. So, like the promises that Europe has now made to Ukraine may have their, may. I mean, it seems very unlikely, but still, if there's a lesson to be learned, we should be careful that if those expectations are met, they may also create grievances in Ukraine as well. So that's kind of like the overview of the chapter. Now, I'm happy to hear Roy's critiques or comments, and then we'll move on to questions, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. Well, afternoon. Yes, it's a fascinating chapter to read, and I'm going to use it to trigger some historic memories of that period. Really, I haven't spoken on the 1990s for a very long time, so I'm going to focus really more on the 1990s, since I'm sure people here in the room have views on the 2000s, the current period, which I normally speak on. And I won't say much on Turkey either, because I would fairly quickly I lose my footing, I think, very quickly. And I don't wish this to appear deterministic, but I think we can now, it's easier to be able to identify some of the logjams that really prevented that kind of post-integration into the international order. At least I would claim so. And I think I'll start with something ideational. So what was the interest of political forces in Moscow in the early 1990s in this form of integration? So in the chapter, you do refer to the notion of new thinking. I'd say the new thinking actually died Yeltsin. So by the time he came in, it wasn't, I think, the universalist new thinking of Gorbachev. The definition was very much more national interests. It was a far more pragmatic, less ambitious agenda altogether. And there was a very brief period of what I'd call liberal Westernism. There was a book that we worked on in the 1990s that looked at these ideational streams, liberal Westernism. From 1991, I'd say not much more than 1992, and it was shallowly rooted in the political fabric. There were different political currents, and the other ones we described as the pragmatic nationalists and fundamentalist nationalists. The pragmatic nationalists won out over time. But it's important that these attitudes towards the West were, if anything, I think they were a bit eclipsed by the cleavages and attitudes towards the post-Soviet states and conflicts. So this is, I think, a gap there in the chapter. There's not much reference to that. And the way that Russian attitudes to this region affected the perception that Western states had of it. The consensus developed quite quickly that Russia's core interests were actually in that region, and that Russian relations with the other states here were legitimately hierarchical. That Russia should have a recognized primacy, and that the sovereignty of these states should be relativized. The call for Russian-style peacekeeping to be recognized by enough nations was an aspect of that. UN mandate, which wasn't given. And of course, you could say this is at odds with the Paris Charter, Europe wholly free, and so on. The focus of that was further west. But certainly it was at odds with the CSCE principles, which Russia was signed up to. There are understandings there. You also had in Russia other calls for Slavic union, a belief that reintegration with these other states was inevitable and just. Now, you might view this all as something of an inevitable legacy of the collapse of Soviet empire. But I would say the normative legacy, the normative challenge for Western states of that went rather further. And it really arose from the whole collapse of Soviet superpower and the associated psychological and normative baggage that went with that. The core problem, I think, was that, and it blighted Russian relations, European counterparts, was rooted in Russia's view of itself as, with both the Soviet and further back a sort of greater Russian attitude, national conception of not being like other states. This is a concept of not like others. Its special status and role. So maybe this is partly an expression of grievance dynamics to go back further, but I'm not sure it's only that. And in practice, I think it meant that Russian assumptions of dominance over other post-Soviet states were unacceptable Western proponents of the liberal international order. And crucially, it came across as paternalistic or worse to the East Central European states, the former Warsaw Pact states, say, the former outer empire, if you like. It was keenly felt by them. I mean, after all, their return to Europe was a normative, ideational, but also a security imperative for them, particularly countries like Poland. And I don't really view drawing them into the liberal international order as undeserved recognition in the chapter. The way I view it, and this isn't what I specialise in really, is their cultural normative association with Europe ran really deep. It was a natural reintegration, if you like. And with their determination to enter Western clubs and benefit from membership, they are aghast at Russian efforts to enter these clubs while holding the attitude that Russia had to be treated differently as a great power, to the point of even wishing to have veto rights. And you find it in these efforts at institutionalization, this was the undoing of many of them. And for example, there are later efforts, exploratory talks about a Russia-EU Council, but that really couldn't work. Russia was seeking veto rights effectively in it. I mean, still, and also, I find that there was a remarkable effort at drawing Russia into the institutional makeup of the international order. I hammered out all the different aspects, Russia in the EU, Russia and NATO, just in the 1990s. And I'm not going to run through it all, but there's a lot there. it goes further than one might expect, given the domestic situation in Russia, which I'm going on to say a few words about in a moment. Now, well, let's come to this, the domestic politics. If you look at Yeltsin's attack on the Duma in 1993, it's hardly an expression of democratic practice. The surge forward of the Liberal Democrat Party in December 1993, Chechnya, the 1996 presidential election, that really, it's amazing that Yeltsin could have won that, seemed to be democratically. Certainly wasn't expecting West. I was asked to brief Prime Minister, then John Major, in number 10, because he was going to Moscow to meet Zyuganov. Expected he would be the future leader. Well, Yeltsin pulled through somehow. But then, not long after, he appointed Primakov as foreign minister, then prime minister, head of foreign intelligence, arch conservative, and that this kind of pragmatic nationalist position was even more entrenched. I mean, all of this created, I think, the realistic chance, I would say, Russian political recidivism or eventism. After 1996, I think it's hardly surprising, therefore, that there was Western wariness and deeper concern in Central and Eastern Europe. A couple of other points. So, in the chapter, the claim there's a backlash when Kozyreg's liberal view to the West declined, backlash within Russian politics, and it strengthened the hands of the conservatives and nationalists. Well, I suppose to some extent that's true, although my argument is that the focus of efforts is more towards the Soviet states. But as I said, there wasn't too much focus on the West. There are other cases later which are really quite renowned and have been much discussed. Let's take, you could take the case of Kosovo in 1999, right? That seemed to be an exclusion of Russia from a Western project, a forceful Western project, a definition of humanitarian intervention that Russia didn't go along with, and so on. But if you actually dig into this deeply, Yeltsin's core concern was nothing to do with that at all. It was about exclusion in the UN Security Council, the way the veto was completely sidelined, and that was the institution expressed structural in the system. One of the few elements that Russia still had left. There wasn't really about the normative element was really there, and Chechnya, I think, really deserves a moment of reflection. It raised deep worries in the West about the brutality of the Russian military, its flouting of wider international norms, about humans as the object of international law. This was beginning to develop during the 1990s. The permissive role of the Russian military and security agencies. And indeed, in the period up to the 1996 election, Yeltsin drew top military and security personnel into government, into foreign policy making outside their normal purview. Then he only strengthened that after that, and he turned to the oligarchs. And actually, I would go so far to say that Yeltsin himself had this authoritarian streak in him. So it's not just a matter of political electoral politics forcing Yeltsin into taking a more increasingly authoritarian stance at home. I think it actually drew on aspects of his own political persona. That may not be very popular in some quarters, but I think that the case can be made. Finally, Ukraine. Well, Ukraine was ignored largely up to 1994, almost completely, and then it was suddenly came onto the American security policy radar because of the need to reach the agreement over the withdrawal nuclear weapons. But I would say that after that, further into the 1990s, it wasn't wholly ignored. There were efforts to some parallel institutional development. But to the extent that it was, then it was partly because Yeltsin Ukraine under the Ruch national movement, the Leonid Kravchuk, seemed to be set on a course anyway. Didn't need too much pushing, and with time, that was expected to have dividends. But I think it is worth considering. And in the 1990s, certainly there was a period in which Ukraine was constantly seeking further inclusion and was given fairly short shrift. But I think the final point at the end of the chapter, for me, is a bit of a red flag. About the final sentence, really, about the West's halfway commitment to Ukraine in the current war may breed more resentment in the long run. I mean, maybe it's just a matter of wording.
Well, I mean, you have to remember that I'm writing this in 2022, but it's so. I still stand by it. You know, if it doesn't still.
I think that there is a real concern that cutting back Western commitment, and particularly American commitment, will lead to a rising narrative about betrayal in the Ukrainian body politic, and Russia can use that. I think that's there, certainly, but the alternative, the lack of commitment from the start, you think of the implications of what that would be, and how far Ukraine had come by 2022 in developing its sense of itself as a state and a nation. I think that would have been from Ukraine's far forward south. The resentments came out well. Discuss it, I think.
Great. I think we have some.
I mean, I take your point. So I don't disagree with what you said, but I think the argument is not like, oh, these resentments are so justified, and how great and Turkey are, and Russia. Like, the argument is something different. The argument is, or like, why was Russia excluded? So, like, to talk about the reasons why Turkey or Russia were excluded doesn't really. I mean, I don't take that as a criticism of my argument. What I'm saying is, excluding, and then sometimes including, and then sometimes supporting things. You know, it's this inconsistency that creates problems for the liberal international order down the line. Like, I'm writing it from the perspective of the liberal international order, not like war Turkey or like war Russia. So it's, you know, of course there were many reasons why Turkey and, you know, Russia were, in terms of undeserved recognition meaning, like, I do think that some of the standards were relaxed for the inclusion of the former, you know, Iron countries, which may be fine. You could say, oh, that's for identity of their Europeans or whatever, but it contributes to the sense that this is not a merit-based club. It's not about objective standards or criteria. It's actually, like, you know, a completely identity-based. Again, it generates this feeling of unfairness, which then is like deployed domestically. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been included. As I said, actually, it's hard for, even in hindsight, it's hard to imagine a scenario where, like, Russia was included along with these countries. So if that fully included, right? If I think that would have probably created all sorts of problems for those countries. So, like, it was kind of like making a choice, right? Like, you either have one or the other. If that. So I'm not. It's not an argument for, like, oh, let's have we should have had full inclusion. The inconsistency, I think, was really problematic. That's my argument.
But maybe since you mentioned the word club, let me drive the conversation in a different direction. So what are we talking about? Is it liberal international order at the systemic levels of analysis, or is it about Europe? Right, because all those stories are about specifically the European regional setting.
Yeah.
On the international level, you can argue that there is quite a bit of inclusion. I mean, Russia G8, capitalist transformation in Russia, opening of markets, the special relationship with the US, Clinton in '96, stepping in on behalf of Yeltsin. There's a lot of, and ultimately WTO as well, when Russia joined in 2010. That was a big story at the time. It seems to me we're talking about Europe specifically and not the international level. And then with the European order, maybe the devil's advocate and argue the case, maybe with Tim and others in this discussion, that actually there's quite a bit of inclusion also on the Russian side. I mean, it's very clear with the Turkish side, with EU membership. But on the Russian side, if you think about Europe not as Brussels Europe.
You mean not membership?
No, thinking about first of all, the bottom-up aspects of integration, right? Russia discovers economic interdependence, which is a story that starts really in the 1970s under the Soviets with the energy trades. The Russian middle class discovering Europe, vacations in Spain, second homes in Cyprus, and so on and so forth. This level of integration, European culture becoming a thing, interdependence evolving. On the institutional side, Russian ideas about security. Of course, they were sidelined because of NATO expansion, but there was OSCE, so CSE becomes institutionalized. There are various permutations of, there is the contact group in Yugoslavia. Russia becomes involved in peacekeeping under NATO. So I can see a lot of half-full in this story as well. So that's sort of my reaction, if you look at the European context in a more granular sense. But it is a question, what are you looking for? I think it's good to gaze the proverbial crystal ball. Now, of course, Russia is the other. Less so Turkey, because Turkey still, I think, thinks about pragmatic accommodation. But is this relationship over, the inclusion into Europe? How do we see the sort of the umbilical cord? The official rhetoric is Russia has nothing to do with it. We're in a post-Western world. Europe is per se that the 2000s when Putin was sort of speaking German and getting Berlusconi to speak in the Kremlin. But there is a side of the story saying that many of those links remain in place. Interdependence is there. Russian society is the side. I mean, equally on the Turkish side, of course, Turkey is a bit of power. Everyone looks at himself as the leader of Sunni Muslims and feels at home in the Gulf. But at the social level and economic level, those interdependencies are still there. So can we have this, what people call it, the drawbridge option that we can actually turn away from this regional order? Or we think that, I mean, I'm more in the latter camp thinking that because of this bottom-up aspect, of the osmotic aspect of European integration or European order, it's very difficult to envisage a scenario where those two specifically are totally decoupled from the context. Right?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that there's an interesting variable here that you bring up about two-thirds way through the chapter, and that is about actual material capabilities and structural power and so forth. So, and I didn't mention, but it is very relevant that in the 1990s, Russia's economy was collapsing progressively. I mean, the GDP was on a steep decline right all the way to the crash in 1999. So that meant state capacities, ability to engage things, but also its attractiveness as a institutional partner in all kinds of ways. Ukraine was doing even worse, actually. So that didn't really help. Then it changes in the 2000s, particularly by 2003, Russian economy, the size of the Russian economy is about the same as 1993. It's taken up till then, and then it just goes on this steep upward climb. And that gives agency that may not have really been there in the same way. And so maybe it's only in that period the real choices Russia has, more of the opportunity to make those choices rather than being the supplicants. And so we should look at that period. So I mean, to answer your question, because otherwise it's rather artificial in the 1990s. And well, of course, you might answer it differently if it was pre-2022 or post-2022. And that's about how far you consider that to represent a watershed, structurally, normatively, as everything else, on both sides. And Russia's also turned against Greece. That's the question. I don't think Turkey there's been a moment of this kind of that. Okay, right? So there's some big difference in trajectories.
I mean, obviously the trajectory is divergent a little bit because of what Russia has done. Turkey has now become valuable to Europe and has gained some leverage vis-a-vis Europe, again because of what the choices that Putin has made. But I think the relationship has changed. So it's like, what's the future of this relationship? So it's hard for me to imagine, even if like Erdogan's not in power, like the same like desire to like join this club. And I don't think that's necessarily specific to Turkey. I mean, there is a growing sense, I think, globally that Europe is kind of like weak. I mean, maybe not economically weak, but it's not like the center of the world that it used to be. It has to deal with, you know, the US, and you know, like, so it doesn't have that same kind of pull. Yeah, so it's hard, even at post Erdogan, like let's say Turkey goes back to being democratic. I just don't see it being conciliatory in the same way that it was previously.
Maybe that's the moment open for reactions and questions.
Great, thanks. So I have not read the chapter.
Maybe you can introduce yourself. Or
Stuff Doug, I'm in DPIR, and so I should apologize. I haven't read the chapter. I look forward to reading
Okay.
it. So I'm going off what you've been talking about. I should say that I'm actually quite sympathetic to this dashed hope story, this narrative. So in lots of findings in economics and political economy about how expectations matter far more than absolute levels of wealth, for instance. And so you can see that where, for instance, people are much more prone targets to populist appeals in the United States if, in terms of how they compare themselves to their parents and so on, than actual levels of wealth. That said, I kind of wonder whether the story works in these two cases. And so what if the story is exactly the opposite? And what actually happened is that this halfway house was, optimal in terms of offering a dangling carrot to lead to reforms. And so the EU dangling carrot led to the greatest period of reforms in Turkey and over that decade. And then what we saw was a reaction to those reforms. And so a little bit along the lines of what you were saying, that we did see a lot of change, constitutional reforms, and these packages, especially after the IMF package in 2001 in Turkey, which, by the way, very much mimicked the same economic trajectory of Russia, this recovery in the early 2000s. And so how would we know the difference between those two? And I guess, to me, the test would be, do we see an alignment of views subnationally, right? So what you're suggesting is that those individuals and those groups that had most pined their hopes on Western embrace then felt betrayed, and as a result shifted to political entrepreneurs who were offering them something else. Or is it that no, those groups still are pining today for the same kind of Western embrace, but in response to reforms that did happen, in response to some Westernization, in response to norms that were taken on, you saw greater appeals to a reactionary right-wing groups that they never felt betrayed. They actually felt relieved, right? That the West did not pull them in more. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I wonder whether you have a sense of, does this story line up with kind of subnationally how you would expect to see it play out?
It's kind of both, I suppose. So when I say it's like this halfway house was the wrong thing, as I said, like I'm saying it from the perspective of Europe or like the liberal international, so it's what I'm saying is domestically what's happening, at least I won't speak to the Russian case, but in the Turkish case, what's happening is I think the groups that wanted like Western integration grew somewhat disillusioned over time. The others maybe didn't want it anyway, but there's always that kind of unifying card, like, you know, we're being treated double standards, like that's kind of like a bipartisan thing in Turkey. So that's like that has broad appeal. That's not something that's only Erdogan supporters think. So that allows, that kind of props up, along with, you know, various embraces, selective embraces, that has helped prop Erdogan up. At the same time, Turkey being somewhat in these institutions also allows Turkey, in a different way than Russia, but like also, I mean, I think there's kind of a parallel story, like sometimes undermine these institutions or like use its presence as a leverage. So the story is not all of Turks, like, you know. So the story is from the perspective of the core. They should have either be included or excluded. So it's the selective stuff that's, you know, that's responsible for the last 10 years. I don't know. I mean, again, it's not like, you know, I have to think more about maybe the causal mechanisms. But that's my sense.
Timothy Gartnash, European Studies Centre. Actually, since you mentioned my exchange with Yuri Sleshkin, perhaps I can start with that.
Yes,
I think you can
please.
find it online. So Yuri Sleshkin, wonderful historian of Russia, says, number one, Russia is far too big, powerful, important, and orthodox to be a member of the European Union. Therefore, there was no European option. Number two, you, the West, didn't make any serious efforts to integrate Russia, to which the answer is, number one, it's absurd to pretend that EU membership is the only European possibility. As Roy said, it was precisely about common European home, the Gorbachev slogan. It was OSCE, it was NATO-Russia partnership. It was conceived by the West as a special relationship. There was never the full offer, unlike the Turk. And number two, incredibly serious, genuine, even passionate efforts were made, particularly in Germany, but also the Clinton administration. And as Roy rightly said, in that case, it's very clear it's what happens in Russia that makes it impossible, that breaks it down. Now, the Turkish case seems to be much closer to the case you're arguing. I mean, I don't think it's so significant that the Central Europeans jumped the queue, because I mean, that was kind of obvious, right? If the slogan was the return to Europe, immense enthusiasm for 1989. They didn't get in until 2004. But, you know, to accept Turkey as a candidate for EU membership in 1999 was a remarkable thing. Europe's civilization other for centuries, but Islam. This was a big thing. It was absolutely going against civilizational definitions of Europe. And we had Recep Tayyip Erdogan here in 2004. Dimo will remember. Turkey may be the sick man of Europe, but it's a sick man of Europe. We are great Europeans. We believe in European values. I mean, take it as you will, but there was a real sense. What then happens is Merkel comes to power, post-terrorist attacks in Europe, immigration becoming a theme, and she says, no way, absolutely not, knocks it on the head. And by the way, I don't want the AK party to be the biggest party in the European Parliament. I want the CDU to be the biggest party. And then Sarkozy joins it. And from that point forward, from 2005, it's sheer hypocrisy on the part of the European Union. And for the last 20 years, it's sheer hypocrisy. And so people like Hakan Antony, who's here, who I'd like to hear on this, can tell you the story of disillusionment. Now, this brings me to two questions. One to Ayşe, but to Hakan also. In counterfactual, obviously impossible to argue, say definitely. Suppose the European commitment had remained absolutely genuine, as it was for Tony Blair, by the way. Tony Blair was absolutely genuine in wanting Turkey. Suppose the European commitment had remained genuine for a longer period. No Sarkozy, no Merkel. Do we think Turkey would have continued down the path, meeting the criteria that countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary did meet? Or were the internal resistances in Turkey too strong? That's question number one. Question number two connects to it. This can be taken as a broader question. What happens in both cases is that the civilizational discourse starts to prevail. Self-definition of Russia, civilizational terms, self-definition of Turkey in civilizational terms, and then in the EU, you get the civilizational term. So, as it were, a neutral concept of liberal international order is being trumped by civilizational discourses on both sides, right? So the question here is the civilizational component an objective factor which is necessarily making this accommodation impossible in some sort of special relationship? Or is it when it becomes a self-definitional factor that it becomes, the insuperable obstacle? Two questions to both.
Yeah.
Can do you want to?
No, it's a good no.
Okay.
I think maybe Hakan has more to say about this. I mean, they're very good questions, Tim. And when I was writing, as I said, I wrote the chapter some time ago, and because I was asked to revisit the 1990s, I didn't write it I didn't write it with really blaming people. It was I was trying to understand wrong timing, wrong decisions at the wrong times. And I really looking at it from the perspective of today, as I said, where people are, not well intentioned at all. It seems hard to judge this period where I think a lot of people were well intentioned and believed what they were doing. So, so in terms of, the counterfactual. I have a. For me, one of the turning points comes much later, and it's with Merkel. It's the refugee deal, really propping up Erdogan at a time when he could have been replaced democratically. So that's the point at which Europe really starts making devil's bargains with an increasingly authoritarian Turkey, and then starts having I think real complicity in the regime that we have at the moment. Before that, as I said, I think there is a degree of condescension, all these social hierarchies that I think are animated thinking. So some of that is there, but I do think I agree with you that before there were people who had maybe genuine commitment to the idea of liberalism. So, the counterfactual requires, tying it to your second question, the civilization discourse, so we shouldn't have had 9/11 because it's after that point all the civilizational discourse really, grabbed people's imaginations and then reinforcing each other. So, I don't know. Again, I'd like to hear what Hakan says because he was more in the field than I was. Where do you think things went wrong? Yeah.
I can maybe introduce yourself to the.
Sure. Hakan Antony, former member of the European Studies Center. Let me make quick but multiple points. And ask some questions as well. But you say mistakes were made. Right? Does that mean that if we knew everything that we know now, that any of the actors would have acted differently? Okay. So then we are not talking about mistakes. We are talking about something else. Right? And then, as Tim alluded to, who's the subject? The passive voice hides the subject, right?
It's an expression. That's why I use it.
Sure. It's a very sexy title, I have to say. and sexy things hide something that we look into. And I agree with Tim. I mean, a Schroeder Chirac Europe is different than a Merkel Sarkozy Europe, right? And we were on the receiving end of that difference. I would say more Sarkozy than Merkel. Merkel was a good, Protestant, stick to your promises. But Sarkozy not only, unlike Merkel, he didn't say Turkish membership is a bad idea. He said Turkey is ineligible for membership. Very different thing. Taking back 45 years of European community decisions, and nobody in Europe spoke up. And that dimmed some spirits. I also have a little disagreement with your suggestion that it would have been better if Europe was more honest and said membership is not on the table and will never be on the table, because in that case, at least official Ankara would have become much more adversarial, a bit like China and Russia, and actively sabotage the European project. And understandable, because if Europe, 500 people, is going to be silent on various Greek maximalisms, Turkey can treat that entity as a foe. So I don't think there will be any crying over spilled milk. Now, for people like me and a few other friends who try to use EU membership perspective for democratizing Turkey, of course, it has been a huge disappointment. I used to view EU perspective as an asset. Now I see it as a liability. It hurts our efforts to make Turkey a more democratic place. And Europe has to take some responsibility for this. On Tim's question of if the perspective was credible, would things have been differently? I would say absolutely yes. I'm no doubt about it. I could have, because I was dealing with both Ankara and Brussels, I feel I could see body language perspectives moving and things becoming very difficult to achieve. And one final point on whether we were too optimistic, whether we overshot our optimism or overshot our pessimism at different periods. I think one constant has been a lack of seriousness. Right? I mean, I will challenge anyone to point an equivalent of Tim's seniority and granular understanding of Poland for a voice about Turkey in Europe. That's a problem. If Europe was serious, at the seriousness of purpose, it had to be more curious about what was happening in Turkey. Both the optimism was superficial and the pessimism is superficial. So, and I think there's a role for institutions like Oxford and Cambridge and European Studies Center to demonstrate that seriousness of purpose looks like a specific thing. It goes beyond articles in the Economist.
Also, Brexit, there's a lot of sympathy for the Turkish case, I guess. That's going to be, but maybe there are other comments.
I mean, just one quick response. I do think if Turkey had been excluded, Ankara could have turned more hostile, but it probably would have had less ability to less leverage. I don't know that. It's Anyway, but we can disagree on that.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't mention civilizational dialogue or difference or narratives all that period of time. The attitudinal problems that I referred to, and the partly psychological, were much more to do with approaches to the hierarchical. It's about primacy, about claimed rights, the ordering status, and things like that. Of course, that went with the multipolarity dialogue, which was more aspirational for most of its time, and it started to become a little bit less aspirational. as we go on beyond the 2000s, along with that comes something of a view about multi-normativity, which is interesting because in IR, pluralism and international relations and so forth, that maps onto that discussion. But I would say, this is my own view, is that the civilizational narrative was ramped up instrumentally from about 2012. You see it because you don't get, if it's a matter of identity, identities don't change quickly like that. This is a basic understanding of people who dabble in constructivism and so on. It doesn't really happen like that. And it's just turned on and then it's ramped up. And in particular, what makes it seem so artificial is the way that it spins off away from Europe, it was Asia and then China. And so you have now the latest iteration, this is Greater Eurasian Partnership. So you're in some cozy, great, larger framework with China. Well, as far as Russian elites, people are concerned, there's no cultural, civilizational sense of commonality really with the Chinese. I don't need to really spell it all out. So, yeah, I mean, there are a few ideologues who have been promoting this, Russia having used, well, and there is a strain of thinking, of course, in Russia, going back through the Orthodox Church, Russian as the Third Rome and all of that. That's there, but it hasn't really spilled off into international affairs until it's been heard like this, used, I think.
But also in Russia, if I may interject, there is this discourse which doesn't start yesterday about we being betrayed. Right? Europe has betrayed itself because it's going in the wrong direction, whereas we are married to conservative values. I mean, even in the 19th century, there was the iteration of that. And therefore, we are there to save Europe from itself, a bit like the J.D. Vance take on coming from Moscow.
Yeah, I think it could be something, an alternative conception of Europe sounds a bit more credible as a claim or something that could be accepted in Russia. But once it veers towards redefinition east, it just loses credibility.
Yeah, I mean, one piece of evidence is the Russian telegram for those of you who go there. And there's some Russians see the sheer volume of racism directed at other Asians, I mean, Central Asians certainly, but also the Chinese, or the ladies later. So political correctness is not strong on Telegram in the Russosphere, as you might expect. But there was a comment over there. Yeah.
Suzanne Martin Phillips. Thank you very much. I was wondering, within this entire business, was there any consideration given to the fact that both countries, Russia and Turkey, bridge two continents, Europe and Asia?
In that period?
Yeah. Did it play a role at all?
Much. Well, I suspect, yes. I mean, the bridge metaphor was like really invoked a lot in that period, and it was certainly part of, Turkey's, and I think to some extent, it comes up in Russian discourse too, neither one or other. I mean, now, like, yes, there's been this shift, but one of the general themes is like this in-betweenness, and that being maybe an asset but specifically in the 1990s, how often and how frequently one would have to go study. But you mean from the perspective of the decision makers? Yeah, I don't know. Do you remember this bridge metaphor? Oh,
I think it was much less present in the 1990s.
1990s,
People
yes.
were much more already.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe 2000s.
China was not a superpower.
Good question. Yeah.
Yeah, Jonathan Shaler, European Studies Centre. I spent longer than I care to say working for the European Commission. Quite a lot of it on enlargement, various times. And my first contact with Turkey was when I was dealing with Southern Europe. And we were just beginning the accession negotiations with Greece after Greece had been coming from the cold of the colonials. And Turkey, which had been the poster child of the late 60s and early 70s for the EC, as it then was, had become slightly more problematic, but was still very much on the radar as having a European vocation. And that sort of chunted along until 1989, and we went into the 1990s. And I think I was very struck by what Hakan was saying about the lack of seriousness. And I think, sadly, that lack of seriousness was not confined to Russia and Turkey. I think there was an element of it in the work in the 1990s and 2000s of EU enlargement. And it depended very much on individuals involved in the relationship with particular countries as to how serious the look was at what was really going on. And I can remember, Dimo, probably you too, that suddenly in about 2003, people discovered that things in Bulgaria were not quite as rosy as they had been painted by some of those involved at EU level in the enlargement process. So, I suspect that it points still to one of the sort of sad elements of how the EU goes about accession negotiations. That it's still very much an institutional, legalistic thinking rather than a complete understanding of what's really going on, despite everybody's best effort. The other point I think I would make is that, Tim was absolutely right. I don't think anybody ever seriously considered Russia joining the EU. It was just sort of economically, in terms of population and land area and so forth, inconceivable. But the sort of common European home idea was one which was certainly pushed. But with Turkey, I think there was an economic population issue, which was particularly difficult, I think, for France and Germany to live with. That suddenly they would no longer be the largest member state, and particularly for France, Germany and Turkey would more or less have been on a par. But you also have the spectre of free movement, which became, as the 1990s and 2000s rolled on, something which was always going to be a big challenge. I think back there to the worries about Spain and Portugal when that enlargement was going on.
Do you think the lack of seriousness was because there was this idea that there's no external challenge or competitor? There's no reason to be serious.
No, I that may have been part of it, but I think the primary issue was that it took a very long time, and certainly in the 1990s. I don't think that the European institutions had really understood the depth of the transition which was needed, particularly in the post-communist countries. But in Turkey, I think that there was a different lack of understanding of what would have been needed. And compounded by the worries about, in certain member states, and I can remember the disappointment after the Sarkozy intervention over Turkey, that, could things have evolved differently? I really don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe just to bring the conversation back to the systemic level and push both of you and bring the elephant in the room, that is the United States. I mean, up to this point, that this parallel stories about inclusion, exclusion in the European context with reference to the EU. But can we tell the same story in a way, compare and contrast those two countries in their attitude to the United States? Resentment, disappointment, hope that will be traded across various US administration. What would be the global version of this regional story?
I think they're different, and they're very different because for Russia, as Soviet Union, it had its focus on Washington always. It's Americanocentric. It defined itself. This was really the other in whole spectrum of different ways. And there was a certain logic to that as well, because of the nuclear prowess of the two sides and so on. So Russia measured itself always up against America and how it was, extent in which it was, it's sort of status recognition. Nowhere else mattered. I mean, Europe really was it really was inconsequential by comparison. So when Obama described Russia as just a regional power, that really was taken seriously by Putin. You know, the last thing he wished to hear. But at the same time, structurally, the power relationship is so imbalanced, and so there's a core problem. And also on the American side, as Obama's comment showed, there isn't that much readiness to provide the recognition. You know, occasionally through some negotiation processes over Iran, a bit over nuclear weapons and so forth, but it doesn't last. And that breeds a resentment. So I suppose some of those underlying resentments that you talked about, actually, your article you referred to, is part of that. And I see no real solution, actually. I mean, there's a constant hankering to be pulled back. So in the first Trump administration, you may remember that there seemed to be a shift in American policy towards China. This was quite worrying because the notion of a G2 America-China was Russia's nightmare. And what Russia did is it quickly pushed the whole idea of nuclear stability talks to the agenda. And for a short time, it pulled Trump's attention back to that. So they were there, you know, big partners on big responsible players and so on. But that didn't last very long. And actually, China's the other thing here, the other variable, which is complicates this greatly, I mean, for Russia, and the way in which most recently causes the uncertainties around where that US-China relationship will go, advantage, disadvantage of that.
To think it's very different.
Two-hander. It occurs to me when you were speaking that one way of thinking about this is that Ayşe's the worst thing to do is neither one thing nor the other point applies to the EU in the case of Turkey. Clearly, we said
and US, yeah, that's what I was
and Russia in the case of NATO.
Yes.
Because arguably the great mistake from the United States, from the West, comes at the Bucharest summit in 2008, where we do precisely neither one thing nor the other for Ukraine and Georgia. We neither say, yes, we accept a membership action plan, you're on track for NATO, nor do we clearly say you're not on track for NATO, and therefore the Putin can be reassured. So I'd be interested particularly in what Roy thinks about that, but also Ayşe, that the one thing nor the other mistake is EU in the case of Turkey, but NATO in the case of
we can't hear because the villains against Sarkozy and Merkel, Bucharest, with them pushing for delaying the membership action plan.
Correct, but it's actually as well the NATO level.
Sure. The European side.
Yeah, but I mean that's particularly because Putin made quite clear his hand. He played his hand in 2008 with the attack on Georgia, in carving out very clearly the extent of legitimate involvement of Western institutions there, and at the same time also the whole all the discussion with the EU had moved from any sort of partnership and the idea of common spaces and all of that stuff to were putting sort of an integration of integrations, which meant you had an integration mechanism in the EU, concentric circles, you had integration mechanism around the CIS, concentric circles, and these two centres of power then should negotiate as equals in their areas of control and primacy. And of course, that doesn't really go very far with Brussels. So with NATO, it would seem it's off the agenda as well. And actually, I mean, in practice, of course, it wasn't just an American matter. It was, France and Germany would have not very much.
Merkel.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, this is kind of in line with what Tim said. I think Turkey was always much more oriented, at least initially, towards Europe, and it was less of an issue of recognition from the US, like that. That was a separate thing. But just as so just as the European stuff is failing in the Turkish case, I think mistakes were made by the Americans. I mean, I was in with regard to Turkey. I mean, I was in DC. I spent a year in DC on Capitol Hill as a Council on Foreign Relations fellow in 2012, and that whole year, everybody had this idea, and it was being pushed like Turkey as a model. This is after the Arab Spring. Like this reconciling Islam and democracy. Some of that, this may have been like Gülen's lobbying. I don't know, like where it was coming from, but it like really inflated this idea of like Turkey as a civilization that doesn't need Europe, and like it's like a regional power, in this case an upgrade. And it's not a downgrade, but like it's really, so the two things, so the European exclusion and US over inclusion of Turkey in plans, like Obama was immediately like, this is before the protests and so on, like that's really inflated Turkey in a way that's separated from Europe, and we're still seeing.
Maybe I can do this once more my role as a speaker. And around those years, I think in 2005, our friends and colleagues Fiona Hill and Ömer Taşpınar wrote a piece in Survival, AAS magazine, calling Turkey and Russia the Axis excluded, arguing that because they were excluded from order, and therefore they have more reasons to work together. So maybe that's a good point to move from the US to the bilateral, and it's very much in the spirit of our program on Europe in a Changing World, where we think about all those connections that are not necessarily about us in Europe or in the West, but also about the different players. So how do you see the trajectory and the evolution, not just Putin Erdogan, which is like headline dynamic, but also societies and countries with large, close to this couple involved since the 90s. I mean, it's something I've written about, but I'll be curious to get your perspective.
How the relationship is evolving between the two countries,
How,
or with Europe?
No, with the two, specifically Moscow, Ankara. How much history, recognition, identity plays into it, or is it just a matter of structural dynamics or partnerships of convenience or whatever you find?
I mean, both are very personalistic type of regimes at the moment. So there is a working relationship between these two leaders that may not outlast them. At the same time, I always find it interesting, like how much, you normally we say historical grievances and so on. Like you'd expect there to be much higher degrees of, if we just went by history, much higher degrees of threat perception, at least in Turkey vis-a-vis Russia, but where there's like almost, like, I don't know if there have been studies about this, but it's like surprisingly low threat perception compared to, so it's a little bit like Iran, I suppose, Turkey's relationship, like it's kind of a frenemy, always kind of a frenemy relationship. Both, it works when it does, and then it breaks down every now and then, but it's kind of resumed, and I don't know what you call it, partnership of colonies. You should speak about this more than I should.
Well, next time.
Yes.
But Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, you know this field, inside out, Dimitar. But I mean, clearly there's a certain normative convergence there about democratic legitimacy standards of etc. Not accepting those. Apparently did tip off Erdogan about the coup coming, that kind of thing. So that helps, and I think it means the two individuals when they meet have got a certain bonding. There's also all the practical, transactional energy and so forth, nuclear, civil nuclear energy and so on, which matters for both sides. But of course, they're interested in cut across each other quite significantly in a number of regional axes, to the extent that Turkish soldiers have been killed in Syria, and Russia hasn't done terribly well in Libya in the contest and so forth, and now around Karabakh. So that you think that would be more significant, but it's been managed. It's almost as if there's a trade-off of power relations. You can just win some, lose some approach. It's quite surprising. The question I have is really how Putin regards the shifting balance in the Black Sea. It's not only the Black Sea fleet has taken quite a knocking and can't really move around as it did before, but NATO's taking a greater interest clearly as well. Turkey, the NATO state. Russia has always been as it were, the naval rival of Turkey historically in the region as well, and I think would look on developments quite to favour. You have to wonder how that's regarded in Moscow.
You forgot to mention the Trump route for prosperity in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and J.D. Vance going there. Probably another footnote to the story.
Yeah.
Any questions, or we exhausted at this point? Yeah. Maybe it's now time to thank our speakers for this excellent conversation.
And thank you for all the comments.
But just to say that I'm really happy we had this exchange here, because again, this aligns with what we've been doing with the Dahrendorf program on those 5 countries we call Cyprus, China, India, Turkey, Russia, and the United States. So I don't know, Turkey's
The new BRICS.
Yeah, exactly. We have a Cyprus summit in Izmir or in Sochi one day. But it's been really fruitful. Stay tuned for the events, and obviously for annual lecture on the 1st of May. Details follow soon. And thank you, Ayşe, for making the way from the other place to the talks with her. And thank you, Roy, for your comments. It's been great.